There's a photograph taken somewhere inside an IRGC command facility. I don't know exactly when it was taken, but I've seen the kind of room it came from. The maps, the overlays, the coastline marked in segments, the approach corridors color-coded by threat level. Someone spent decades building what was in that room. And the war they planned for never came. Look, I have a take on this, and I'll be upfront about what it is. I don't think the story of Hormuz is about the Osprey. I don't think it's about the Marines. I think it's about the geographic illusion, the belief held by Iranian commanders and most Western observers that holding the ground still means standing on it. Iran built something extraordinary at Hormuz, a genuine fortress, one that held for 30 days against the most intensive naval campaign since the Second World War. And when the war arrived from above, the fortress had no ceiling. My position: the US didn't find a smarter weapon. Iran asked the wrong question. For 40 years, with real resources and serious people, they built the correct answer to a question that had already been replaced. That's where I'm standing. You should know that before we go further. At some point in the last 30 days, inside a hardened facility along Iran's southern coast, an Iranian military planner looked at his screens and understood something. Not that the Americans had better missiles, not that the Osprey was faster than his models predicted. Something worse. He understood that the war he had spent his career preparing for, the war with the mines and the fortress islands and the tunnel networks and the toll gates, had been designed to stop an enemy that didn't come. The enemy that came arrived from above. To understand why that moment matters, why it isn't a tactical footnote, but the central fact of what happened at Hormuz, you have to understand what Iran actually built, and you have to give it the respect it deserves. Because the geographic illusion isn't a stupid mistake, it is the entirely rational response to a world where you have to make resource decisions decades before the war begins. The Defense Intelligence Agency estimated Iran held more than 5,000 naval mines before this campaign began. Laid from speedboats, submarines, shore positions, placed before day one. Passive, patient, invisible on the seabed, the fortress islands, Abu Musa, Larak, Keshem, converted over decades into what Iranian commanders called fixed, unsinkable aircraft carriers, radar installations, the Noor anti-ship missile sea-skimming at 15 feet above the waterline, below the scan horizon of most shipborne radars, switching to active radar homing only in the terminal phase to minimize the detection window, mobile launchers inside tunnel networks, emergence to launch in under 90 seconds. Satellite imagery can find the tunnel mouth. It cannot predict which mouth or when. 1,000 miles of southern coastline backed by buried coastal batteries. A toll gate, a documented checkpoint, controlling every vessel passing between Larak and Keshem. The engineering on the Noor missile alone deserves honest acknowledgement. Iran reverse-engineered it from the Chinese C-802, then mass-produced it domestically, 15 to 20 feet above the waterline during terminal approach, below the radar horizon until the final 15 seconds of flight. This is not the work of a military that cut corners. This is 40 years of disciplined, systematic, expensive preparation. The problem they were solving just wasn't the problem that arrived. Before I go further, let me explain what the geographic illusion actually is, because I think most coverage skips past the concept too quickly. The geographic illusion is what happens when a military force designs its defenses around the threat it understands rather than the threat it will face. It is not stupidity. It is not laziness. It is the entirely rational response to preparing for war, decades before it begins. You look at history, You look at how your adversary has always fought. You build accordingly. Modern analogy: imagine building the world's most expensive front door. Biometric scanners, steel plating. You are certain no one gets through. Then the intruder uses a ladder and climbs through the third-floor window. The door isn't broken. The door is just irrelevant. Iran's entire coastal defense architecture is the door. 4 decades of engineering, funding, and institutional commitment pointed at the water. The Marines didn't break through the door, they deleted the beach. The reason this matters here is that the Iranian army is still standing behind the door. You know that specific feeling of watching something fail that should have worked, where the logic is sound, the effort was real, and the outcome is still wrong. That's what 30 days at Hormuz looked like from inside the IRGC command structure. 850 Tomahawk cruise missiles, 3 carrier strike groups, 40 warships, thousands of sorties, 13,000 military targets destroyed, and the strait stayed closed. Not because the defense was impenetrable, because the mines were already in the water before day one. Because the tunnel launchers could emerge, fire, and retreat before a satellite pass completed, because the fortress islands sat directly across the shipping lanes, and a warship cannot simply sail past a functioning coastal battery at close range. The Navy brought the right tools for a surface war. Iran had prepared a different kind of war, one that lives beneath the surface, inside mountains, behind geography. And on day 30, and the official record from the Defense Intelligence Agency used language worth quoting exactly. Iran possesses a layered, asymmetric maritime defense architecture designed to deny access through the saturation of sensor-blind corridors. Translation? They hid 5,000 mines and 1,000 miles of coastal missiles behind mountains and didn't try to outgun the US Navy. They tried to out-hide them. I'll be honest, when I started writing the notes for this video, I was going to tell you something different. I was going to argue that the 30-day delay before the Marines arrived was a failure of imagination, that someone should have seen earlier that the surface campaign alone couldn't solve Hormuz. But at 2 in the morning on Tuesday, I found the transit log for the USS Tripoli. The Tripoli isn't configured as a traditional amphibious assault ship. It's a lightning carrier, and it wasn't carrying landing craft. It was carrying Ospreys. That changed the argument I was making, because a ship configured that way isn't the backup plan. It's the sequence. The 30 days weren't a stall. They were the engineering prerequisite. And the prerequisite changes what the arrival means entirely. If you're half listening to this while doing something else, I need you to actually look at the screen for this next part, because this is where the 30-to-1 ratio everyone is citing becomes a rounding error. Iran's parliament speaker wants you to see one number: 150,000. IRGC ground forces, 30-to-1 on paper. Let's do the actual geometry. 150,000 troops. So 1,000 miles of southern coastline, 7 islands requiring garrisons, western border commitments, internal security requirements, distribute evenly across 1,000 miles of coastline, 150 troops per mile. Analysts estimate each island requires between 1,800 and 2,000 personnel to hold properly against a determined assault. The IRGC cannot garrison every island at that density and still cover the coast and the western border simultaneously. Each island garrison in practice likely numbers a few hundred, 5 amphibious ships, each one a floating airfield for Osprey. Repositioning capability at 15 knots means the force can select its point of attack within 12 hours. Iran does not know where the Marines will land. Marines choose one island, launch from 200 nautical miles. 550 Marines concentrate on 5 square miles of island surface against a garrison that may number 300. The ratio flips. 150,000 becomes 300 on the beach. That is not bravado. That is geometry. The attacker chooses the point and concentrates. The defender must be everywhere and spreads thin. This is the oldest principle in warfare. It does not belong to the side with more troops. It belongs to the side with more mobility. The 150,000 men on the mainland might as well be on the moon. No navy left to ferry them. No air cover to fly them. Spectators to their own defeat. Now, here's the pushback I'd expect at this point. Someone is already typing, but what about the mines? If they're still in the water, the strait is still closed regardless of who holds the islands. True. But you cannot sweep mines while coastal batteries are firing at your minesweepers. The Marines didn't land to win the war. They landed to silence the batteries. You seize the islands, you kill the radar, and you create a corridor of safety. Inside that corridor, the Navy's minesweepers can finally work, slowly, methodically, without being blown out of the water. The mines were never the final problem. The batteries protecting the mines were. Now, let me be precise about the physics of how the islands get seized, because this is where Iran's 40-year preparation encounters the specific form of threat it never fully accounted for. The conventional assault helicopter Iran's island garrisons were calibrated to intercept, the CH-46C Knight, the UH-60 Black Hawk, cruises at roughly 140 knots, combat radius around 200 nautical miles, approach altitude well within the engagement envelope of man-portable air defense systems. The MV-22B Osprey is a tiltrotor, 2 engine nacelles mounted on the wingtips, rotating 90 degrees, vertical for takeoff and landing, horizontal for cruise. The conversion takes approximately 12 seconds. 12 seconds to transform a helicopter into an airplane. Cruising speed 270 knots. Combat radius exceeding 390 nautical miles. Transit altitude 15,000 feet. The IGLAS, the most common man-portable system in Iran's inventory, has an effective engagement ceiling of approximately 11,500 feet against targets moving below 400 knots. An Osprey, transiting at 15,000 feet, is outside that envelope entirely. The missile physically cannot reach it during the cruise phase. Man-portable systems become a threat only in the final 60 to 90 seconds of approach, which is precisely why AH-1Z Viper attack helicopters and F-35Bs suppress the landing zone before the Ospreys descend. At 140 knots, a 20-mile detection range gives an island garrison roughly 8 minutes of warning. Time to man positions, activate radar, prepare fire. At 270 knots, that window drops to under 4 minutes. 4 minutes between radar contact and boots on the ground. The garrison doesn't lose because it's outgunned. It loses because the reaction window it was built around, the one measured in minutes, calibrated for helicopters it trained against for decades, collapsed. The Osprey didn't break through the door. It climbed through the window before anyone knew there was a ladder. I want to be intellectually honest here before we go further. Seizing these islands is still a nightmare. Even with Ospreys, you are landing in a contested zone. The bypass doesn't mean bloodless. It means executable. The variable I haven't fully resolved is the Ghadir-class submarine fleet. 20 or more diesel-electric boats designed specifically for the Gulf's shallow, 100-foot waters. If one of those is still lurking with a full battery, the insertion gets considerably messier. What I know is that Epic Fury destroyed the naval bases and submarine tenders in the first week. The surviving boats are running on dying batteries with nowhere safe to surface. Submarines require ports for battery charging, torpedo resupply, crew rotation. Those ports are rubble. What I don't know is whether the math on battery life and operational tempo has fully closed that variable. I'm telling you where I am on that, honestly. I was at a petrol station, completely ordinary Saturday morning, just filling up, and the implication of what I'd been reading about the 82nd Airborne suddenly landed in a way it hadn't when I was actually at the desk. I stopped what I was doing, just stood there with the nozzle in the tank. If the Marines are taking the islands and the Navy is clearing the mines behind them, why is the 82nd Airborne dropping deep inland? It hit me that the bypass wasn't just about the water. The Marines delete the beach. The 82nd Airborne cuts the umbilical cord. They drop onto strategic airfields deep inside Iranian territory and sever the supply lines feeding whatever inland resistance remains. The 150,000 men on the coast never get another bullet or another gallon of fuel. The geographic illusion runs all the way to the interior. Iran built a fortress to control 21 miles of water. America sent a force designed to make the fortress irrelevant from every direction simultaneously. Here is the part that the straightforward military breakdowns won't tell you. And I want to be careful about how I frame this because I'm not entirely comfortable with where the logic leads, but I think it follows honestly from the evidence. The 30-day delay before the Marines arrived wasn't only physics, it was also narrative. Once you put boots on the ground, the exit strategy changes fundamentally. You can stop a bombing campaign. You cannot unland a battalion of Marines without conceding something publicly. The 30 days proved to the American public and to the world that destruction alone wasn't enough. 850 Tomahawks, 3 carrier strike groups, 40 warships, and the strait stayed closed. That sequence created the visible necessity for what came next. I'm not saying the naval campaign was designed to fail. The destruction was real and it mattered structurally. But the fact that 30 days of the most intensive naval bombardment since 1945 couldn't open the strait alone. That fact did political and narrative work that the Marine landing now inherits. The geographic illusion is Iran's failure, but the narrative setup, making the necessity visible before the solution arrived, that belongs to the campaign's architects. I've thought about this a lot, and I still haven't fully resolved whether that's strategy or consequence. Save this framework for the next time you hear a troop count cited in a modern conflict. Presence does not equal power. In the 21st century, the side that can concentrate its force at a single point of its choosing will always defeat the side forced to defend everything. The number on paper tells you almost nothing. The mobility that determines where the number lands tells you almost everything. Here is what I keep coming back to, and this is the part that stops being about Hormuz. The geographic illusion is not an Iranian failure, it is a human one. And the United States has made it more than once. In 1941, American commanders at Pearl Harbor understood that the Japanese Navy was capable of carrier-launched airstrikes. They did not believe the attack would come at Pearl Harbor, specifically at that depth of water, with that kind of modified torpedo. The threat was understood in category. It was not understood in the specific form it took. In 1950, American commanders understood that Chinese forces might intervene in Korea. Intelligence assessments had flagged the possibility. MacArthur's advance toward the Yalu continued. Because the specific form the intervention took, the scale, the speed, the tactical approach didn't match the model. In 2001, the component intelligence existed to anticipate what was coming. The failure was not a lack of information, it was that the specific form of the threat, domestic flight training, simultaneous hijackings, aircraft as weapons, sat outside the architecture of imagination that prior experience had built. Mirror imaging is not a failure of intelligence. It is a failure of imagination constrained by the weight of prior investment. The more you have spent preparing for a specific threat, the more cognitively expensive it becomes to accept that the threat has changed form. Iran spent 40 years and an enormous fraction of its defense budget building an answer to a question that was replaced. That investment made the answer feel more certain, not less, which made it harder to ask whether the question had changed. This channel isn't for people who want the comfortable version of military history. It's for people who'd rather be uncomfortably right than comfortably wrong. If that's you, you're in the right place. By day 30, here is what the preceding weeks had stripped from Iran's layered system. The integrated air defense network is functionally silent. Every radar that activates draws an AGM response. They stopped activating. More than 60 Iranian warships on the seabed, more than 500 missiles and 2,000 drones expended. The production facilities that would rebuild them are rubble. The sea routes for importing replacements are controlled by the Navy. The command network is fractured. Orders that once travelled across an integrated system now move by courier, by radio, by guesswork. Units that once operated as a system now operate as fragments. The mines remain passive, patient, still in the water. But the stockpiles are gone. No new mines will be laid. And just before the first boot touches the ground, the EA-37B compass call, making its combat debut, severs the electromagnetic spectrum. Surviving radars blinded, command frequencies jammed. Iranian defenders in the final minutes of a defense that was never designed for this war, fighting without coordination, in the dark. Layer after layer stripped away, until confrontation means standing on an island alone, watching ospreys descend. You probably know someone who is still reading the Hormuz coverage and thinking the story is about firepower counts. It isn't. It's about the oldest mistake in the history of organized conflict, preparing for the enemy you understand instead of the enemy you'll face. Send them this, not because it's entertaining. Because the next time a troop count gets cited as evidence of strength, they'll know the question to ask first. But here's the question this video opens that I can't answer and won't pretend to. Which military, right now, is doing what Iran did? Which force has spent decades and enormous resources building the correct answer to the last question, and hasn't yet encountered the new one? The US made the mirror imaging error before Pearl Harbor, before Chosin, before Tet. The question isn't whether serious militaries with serious resources and serious people fall into this trap. They do. The question is where it's happening right now, invisibly, inside a defense architecture that feels more certain the more money has been spent on it. If you want to start pulling at that thread, there's a video on this channel that looks at the assumptions buried inside the defense posture currently being built in a very specific part of the Pacific. The parallels are not comfortable. I don't know where you're watching this from. Maybe it's late. Maybe there was something else you were supposed to be doing. But if you've stayed this far, you already understand that the story about who wins and loses at Hormuz is the surface. Underneath it is a story about how every serious institution, military or otherwise, mistakes the certainty that comes from long preparation for the certainty that comes from being right. Those two things feel identical from the inside. They are not the same thing. Galiba says Iranian forces are prepared to confront. But confront what? A ghost? A machine flying at 15,000 feet that doesn't care about the mines? An airborne unit that dropped 50 miles behind the front line? The Iranian army isn't being defeated. It's being unplugged, and the scariest thing about being unplugged is that you don't know the power is out until you try to turn on the lights. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide. The distance between the war Iran prepared for and the war they got is infinite. What does that tell you about who's building the wrong fortress right now? Drop it in the comments. I want to know which military you think is staring at the wrong war with 40 years of preparation behind it, and whether you think they already know it.